Hello and welcome to the interview here on France 24. Well, it was 5 years ago this week that my guest today resigned as Prime Minister of Britain after a decade in power. Now, one global financial crisis later, the Eurozone is facing its gravest crisis in its history. And private citizen Tony Blair, welcome to the show, is watching it all unfold along with the rest of us, even as you remain very active on the world stage, notably as a Middle East envoy. But we're here, I'd like to talk about the Eurozone, because that's where we're at today, really, and that's what everyone seems to be focusing on. When you came to power in 1997, a lot of people said they thought perhaps you were going to bring Britain into the Euro. Ultimately, you decided not to do it. As you look on at what's happening here today, what are you thinking? Are you feeling a bit smug, glad we didn't do that, or are you having some regrets and thinking maybe it could have worked?
The basic reason we didn't was in the end partly the basic reason why there's a problem, which is that for me the single currency was a great idea politically, brought Europe closer together, but it was a political idea expressed in economics. And therefore the economics had to be right and had to align with the politics. And the problem for us was it was never clear that the economics were going to work well for us. And so really what's happened, I think, is that with the single currency crisis, what's happening is that people are having to adjust the politics and the economics at a point of crisis, which is always tough to do. So no, it was the right decision for us to stay out. But by the way, we are heavily impacted in Britain by what's happening.
But I'm just a little surprised when I hear you saying that it was the right decision for Britain to stay out, because it really didn't seem like in the early days that you would have felt that way. And it just seems like a little bit hindsight is 2020.
Well, we didn't, is a fact. But it was really to do with the economics. I mean, we set out a set of economic tests that had to be passed, and they weren't. Now, we didn't foresee what was going to happen with the financial crisis, but in a way, the problem always has been with the euro, that if it's to work, there's got to be a sufficient amount of economic convergence within the eurozone. And that's the heart of the problem. And if you end up with a huge battle between the politics and the arithmetic, then at some point the arithmetic wins unless you adjust it, and that's what people are trying to do now.
That said, Britain has, in the view of a lot of people here on the continent in Europe, especially in France, there's a real strain of Euroscepticism. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you were really constantly coming up against that in popular opinion, and also given the very virulent tabloid press in Britain, which would get right on your back the second you cozied up to Europe in any way, shape, or form.
Sure, and that would have been definitely a problem had we decided to put the case in a referendum to the people. But actually, I always try to keep Britain right at the heart of Europe. With France, indeed, we formed the European Defence Policy, which has now been developed. I actually had charge of the European budget negotiations in 2005, which resulted in Britain having to make difficult compromises to reach a deal, and we did. And so, no, I'm not a Eurosceptic at all. I'm a believer in the European project. I think even if the worst came to the worst, and I hope it doesn't, and believe it won't, but supposing if the worst came to the worst, even in the single currency broke up in some way, I still think the concept of Europe and the concept of a single market with a single currency is the right idea. It's the implementation that's been the problem. And the implementation's been a problem because when you have countries, for example, like Italy, join the single currency, they get a huge drop in their interest rates because they're now in essentially a German currency zone. Unless they then adjust their economy structurally to come into line with that, then at some point you end up with a problem.
So you clearly are in favor of structural reforms, deep structural reforms. You see the need for that. You've said that in the past. In the end, though, with Germany very much for fiscal budgetary discipline, you've hinted or suggested recently that Germany ultimately is going to have to be foursquare behind the euro. Essentially what you're saying is ultimately Germany is going to have to pay up and save the euro.
Yes, ultimately that is what is going to have to happen, but you can't expect the Germans to do that unless they see the rest of Europe coming into a more disciplined framework, which means that the Germans aren't betting their economy on a bad bet. So, I think this is incredibly tough, by the way. I mean, I have huge sympathy for this generation of political leaders dealing with this. I've got a great respect for Angela Merkel and for the other leaders in Europe as they try and struggle with this. But the fact is, in the end, if you're in a single currency, some concept of debt mutualization is necessary for that currency to work.
So you're getting off the fence a little bit. Hollande is really for the mutualization of debts, the pooling of debts in Europe. This is an idea that Merkel has resisted. Are you slightly closer to President Hollande's approach right now to this crisis?
I'm and always have been for the fact that if you want a single currency to work, at the heart of a single currency, look, the United Kingdom is a single currency zone. The United States is a single currency zone. There's no speculation against the currency on the basis it might break up, because people know that
the federal government's behind it.
It stands. You stand behind the single currency.
We don't have that will here in Europe.
Well, we don't have that will because the divergence in economic performance and competitiveness is so great. And so really what you've had in Europe is, in a sense, a sort of balance of payments crisis translated into this single currency speculation and crisis. If you want to meet that, the only way of doing that is that, if you like, Germany, as I say, stands fully behind the single currency. And that does mean the debts of one become the debts of all. But my point is this: you can't expect Germany to take that stand unless the rest of Europe is prepared to change, and change radically in order.
And Germans themselves.
Well, the Germans would argue, I think with some justification, that yes, they may have to change their position on how they stand behind the single currency, but I think they'd be justified in saying the rest of Europe is going to make structural reform.
What would be a harder case to make, for Angela Merkel to convince Germans that it's in their interest to bail out Europe, or for you, when you were Prime Minister, to convince Britons that it's in their interest to join the Eurozone?
I think both are pretty tough.
You have to choose one.
I don't know that I could, but I think, on the other hand, because Germany is part of the single currency, the fact is, for Germany to lose the single currency would be a disaster economically for the country. So they also know that. So you're in a situation where, if you like, to lose the single currency is a disaster. To maintain it requires a very, very tough decision by the German people, by the German government. If you want the single currency to be saved, you've got to, I mean, what I've suggested is, at the heart of this, you've in a sense got to have a grand bargain or a plan in which you have growth, reform, and some sense of debt mutualization.
Let's get back to the British economy right now, which is, I guess, not doing so well either. David Cameron, the current Prime Minister, recently said, not sure actually how recently, but when you were in power, you didn't fix the roof, and now the rain is pouring in. And you can argue you presided over Britain at various points, which was a boom Britain, much better economically. What do you say now to the Conservative government? They say, what, they didn't see it coming? You know, you didn't act in time? You had all the money, you didn't do anything.
I think what you say, frankly, is the same as they now say, look, we've got a problem in Britain because of the Eurozone crisis. I mean, the fact is, Britain is deeply impacted by what is happening in the global economy. You can have an argument, I've had this argument myself, that Labour in probably 2005, 2006 should have started to tighten up. And that was a debate we had at the time within government.
You didn't win that debate.
I didn't win that debate, but my point is this: it was at the margins. The real reason Britain's got a problem is the same reason everyone else has. There was a massive global financial crisis that hit Britain, hit America, hit Europe, hit everywhere in 2008. Now, in the end, you're dealing with the aftermath of that. My point is very simple, that as a result of it, all countries are going to have to adjust to come into line with a new reality.
Do you think Britain can indefinitely stay out of the euro? Is there some point at which it will just make sense, even for the very fiercely protective city of London, which really wants to guard its own interests, it seems?
Well, look, there's nobody in Britain who's going to suggest joining the single currency at the moment. So you're talking about the future a long way off.
1,000 years.
Well, I don't know, it's been quite that long. But I think, look, the thing is very simple for Britain, which is why I always kept the option open of joining. The politics of joining are pretty clear, but the economics have got to be right. If the economics change in time to come, then
isn't that a self-defeating argument, though? Because how is it going to work unless you sort of take that leap of faith, some people might say? You have to join, you have to be in it and make it work together. You can't wait for it to try to work.
Well, no, I've got a feeling that the leap of faith concept is what has got us into this problem. The problem, as I always used to say to people about the single currency, is that, as it says on the tin, it's an economic and monetary union. Right. And therefore, if the economics aren't right, you've got a problem. And the politics you can't by an act of faith politically overcome the economics. That's the problem, and that's the heart of the difficulty we now have. So I think for Britain, actually for all the countries in Europe, unless the economics work, it's both hard to justify and hard to sustain publicly the notion that it survives. Now, we have the single currency. If it disintegrates now, for all the countries that are part of it, it's a catastrophe economically. So it's going to be necessary for us to take the measures to regulate and change the situation. But for Britain, I mean, we've got that option and we'll retain that option. But as I say, I can't see that happening anytime soon.
Anytime soon. We're running out of time. I'd like to ask you, you were passed up once for the EU president's job. I don't think there's any secret. You would have liked to have that job. They went with a relatively unknown Dutch man instead. Would you like to have it? Belgian man, excuse me. Yes. I stand corrected. In the future, would you still like to have that job?
Look, I mean, I doubt it's ever going to be offered, but I said at the time I would have taken it had it been offered. And, as I say, I'm a believer in Europe, but I think for Europe to succeed today, it's got to understand it's going to have to make major political changes. Now, there's going to be a huge political reconstruction of Europe. And the questions of how, if you're going to integrate things like, fiscal policy, you're going to have a banking union and so on, you're going to need to bridge the deficit in democratic accountability for sure.
One quick thing, you're going to be meeting with President François Hollande later today, French president. One sentence, what's the advice if Eurozone comes up, which I suspect it will?
Well, I'm not going to presume to give him advice because I know how tough it is to take the decisions.
He says, Tony Blair, what should I do?
I think the single most important thing is to realize that we are in a situation now where it requires big decisions. You've got to create a new reality around the euro. You can't just manage the existing reality. And I think actually what the European Council did yesterday was important. I think that it does give people an increased sense of confidence that the European leaders are going to do what is necessary. But we're late on this, and we need to
speed up. We're unfortunately going to have to leave it there. Tony Blair, former British Prime Minister, thank you very much for your time today. Moving on to meet with the French President.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for watching the interview here on France 24.